Hey, Rotarians, have you ever wondered what the secret language of our closest relatives, the great apes, might reveal about the origins of human communication? Imagine standing in the heart of an African rainforest watching chimpanzees use gestures, vocalization, and expressions to share ideas, solve problems, and navigate their complex social world. What could we learn about ourselves by decoding their conversations? Our speaker today has dedicated her life to answering these questions. She is the world-leading primatologist whose groundbreaking research has transformed our understanding of how apes communicate and what it tells us about the roots of human language. Her work has taken her from the lush forests of Uganda to lecture halls and global conservation initiatives where she inspires action to protect these extraordinary creatures and their habitats. When not following chimpanzees through the rainforest, she confesses to enjoying good coffee and bad science fiction. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Kat Hobaiter from the University of St. Andrews, a scientist, explorer, and storyteller who brings the wild minds of apes closer to our own.
Thank you so much, buddy. That was such a generous introduction. Are you sitting comfortably? Hopefully, and I realize it's very early there in the morning in California, so thank you for getting up and being with me today at this time. I would like to introduce you to the beginning of one of the stories that we've been looking into as scientists. And maybe it's better to say it's a beginning. It's not the beginning because science has many beginnings. It's really hard to know when an idea starts. But a few years ago, I found myself on a remote expedition in northern Guinea. We were up on the border with Mali and Senegal. I was there with a couple of good friends and colleagues of mine, needing to set up a new chimpanzee field site. And we had to do that with a small group of people from the local communities with whom I had essentially no language in common. I'm incredibly lucky. I grew up in a very multilinguistic family, moving all around the world in my childhood, but I had never come across anything that was related even to the language groups that are used in northern Guinea. At the same time, over the next few weeks, we managed to find resources, build huts and shelter. We mapped and recce'd the local area. We cooked together, ate together, laughed together. We started to swap a few basic phrases, but fundamentally, the heavy lifting of those interactions, I could do that through gesture, through pantomime, through non-linguistic facial expressions and things. But it was a really profound reminder to me as a scientist that actually, while language might have added a lot of ease and it might have added richness and nuance to our lives, it just simply wasn't necessary for us to get through the basic needs of a small day-to-day camp life. And there's a very long list, actually, of human traits that have been proposed as the reason that we need as humans to have language. Lots of very practical things. But at this point, decades of research on other species, whether that's apes like chimpanzees, or whether that's corvids or cetaceans, decades of research have shown us that you do not need language to learn from each other. You don't need language to organize when and where to forage. You don't need language to pass on essential cultural knowledge about things like tools or foods or songs. Other species share all of that with each other. You don't need language to coordinate hunting or even do richly socially structured politics and politicking. The chimpanzees that I live and work with do plenty of forming and breaking of alliances of political kinds. And even production of things like stone tools, which was so crucial in our human history. You can learn those through simple gesture-based instruction. So as a scientist, once we start to go through all the long list of everything that you can actually do without language when you need to, and that we see other species doing every day, it starts to look like human language didn't really start out for anything at all. And that, as you might imagine, as somebody who wants to try to understand the evolutionary origins of it, has been quite frustrating over the years. But as a field, our understanding of how language evolves is founded on these kind of comparisons. We look at what we can do and we compare that to other species. How do we communicate? How do they communicate? And it's just been the case that over the years, with decades of work, particularly once we started to be able to do this in the wild, we just saw greater and greater overlap. And even the kind of human capacities that were these pinnacles of human cognition and thought, things like reference, being able to point to things, refer to things, intentionality, theory of mind, the kind of things where I know that what I understand might be different to what you understand. All of that work now has really been shown to be clearly present in other species, particularly in great apes. And other scientists here at St. Andrews have been really key in bridging that out beyond apes to cetaceans and corvids and other species. So in all of that communicative richness that is going on in the world around us, whether it's dogs barking, birds singing, monkeys calling, why is it that I've spent most of my career looking at great apes gesturing to each other? Well, one of the things that I'd like to start to explain is that when we see many other species communicating out there in the world, we tend to think that it's like language because language comes so easily to us. But actually, a lot of other communication systems are a little bit like radio. They're sort of broadcasting information out there into the world. And it can be very rich and very detailed, very nuanced information, but they're not really thinking about who their audience is. And we do that kind of communicating too. So I can yell when I pick up something too hot in the kitchen. And if you're sitting in the kitchen with me and I've just picked up that hot pan off the stove, you can infer that the pan is hot. My yell tells you that. You get information from the signal that I'm broadcasting. But I didn't yell with the intention of sharing it with you, because I can promise you I would yell whether or not there was, even if there's nobody in the room. I might try to swear a little less if there's someone in the room with me, but fundamentally, I'm not thinking about my audience in that moment. More interestingly, though, what I can do is 2 hours later, when another friend comes into the kitchen, I can tell them, watch out, the pan is hot. I can do that with my language. And at that point, my hand isn't hurting anymore. I'm not being triggered by a stimulus in my environment. I even choose not to repeat it to you because I know that you know, and I know they don't know. So I'm thinking about who my audience is. And with language, I can choose to share ideas and specific information with a specific partner. And it just fundamentally revolutionized our understanding of other species when we realized that, unlike almost any other species in the world today, apart from humans, other apes are actually using their gestures to communicate in that language-like way, that back and forth exchange of information between individuals, between minds. So when an ape is gesturing, they're gesturing to someone. And this was really, really exciting for us. And so over the last couple of decades, we've shown all kinds of evidence of language-like abilities using these systems. We've been able to show that great apes have well over 100 different gestures, that those gestures hold language-like meanings. We've spent years now establishing the rules of what we've affectionately called our Great Ape Dictionary. We can show that those gestures are sometimes combined into sequences, and those sequences hold some of the rules that we see in language. So every time we've established a new Rubicon for what is unique about human language, someone comes along and says, my species can do that too. And I know that because that's been me as a scientist for most of my career. And yet, something that's been a frustration to me in the way in which we've studied other apes' communication is that there don't seem to be any obvious differences. The tools they have in their toolkit are very, very similar to ours. But what we do with those tools seems radically different. The chimpanzees that I live and work with are not writing Shakespeare. They are not sending people to the Mars or to the moon. They're not even, there's not even the most basic of knock-knock jokes in sight in the rainforest. So there remains this enormous gulf in how other apes are using those tools. And I think, though, at the end of the day, what we need to do is refocus our attention. And I'd like to just introduce you to a little bit of some of the ways in which we've been trying to think about how we use language, what language is for, and whether or not we're able to see anything that resembles that use of language in the communication of other species. And there's a quote that I use far too often, but it just beautifully encapsulates what I think about this, which is Sidney Brenner, who was talking about DNA. He said, The difference between the telephone directory and a Shakespeare play is that while both have a grand cast of characters, only the play has a plot. Now, he was using this to argue that if you know the structure of DNA, you're never even if you know that in perfect detail, you're never going to get all the way to describing the uniqueness of human behavior as it's expressed. But the analogy works, I think, really well for communication. I could know every single one of the tools in the toolkit. What are the units? What are the gestures? What are the meanings? But that's still not necessarily going to get me to the plot. And I think if we want to go beyond that sort of grand cast of characters and really understand the plot, that's about understanding identities. It's about understanding relationships. It's about the social world in which we communicate that makes human language so distinctive. And then it's this open question as to whether or not we find similar identity and creativity in the communication of other species. So you're going to have to forgive me. We're going to go briefly into some Gricean linguistics. I will make it as painless as possible. But it is a really important aspect of human language that we don't always stop to think about. Because one characteristic aspect of how humans create meaning is that there is a difference between what we might call the timeless meaning of a word or gesture and its occasion meaning. What I mean by that is that the timeless meaning is a sort of meaning that a word has across lots of different uses. Whereas occasion meanings are the meaning that a word has on a specific set of circumstances. So on Friday at 3:37 p.m. in St. Andrews, when Kat was saying this one thing to her neighbor, what did she mean in that occasion of use? And that flexibility for the same word on different occasions to mean something quite different is very distinctive to human communication. So we can think about this by illustrating the example. So if you're driving along a small dark country road in the evening, somebody might flash their lights at you. Now, to decode that meaning, there's no correlation between flashing your lights and a specific meaning that holds true on every occasion, because there might be a sort of timeless meaning of, hey, pay attention, but you need to think about what the driver intends you to understand on this occasion, because there's different possible meanings to flashing your lights at someone when you drive past them. It could be that there's a problem with your car. It could be that there's a friend that has recognized you and is saying hello. It could also mean that up ahead there's another problem and you need to slow down. Your reaction to them flashing their lights at you needs to be different on each of those occasions, even though that signal has stayed exactly the same. So we can do this, and we do this all the time. So you could, for example, check their car. You don't recognize it, so it's not a friend. Check your car. It's not currently on fire, hopefully, and so maybe there's no problem. Both of those things have happened to me. You could then infer that on this occasion, the driver is giving you a heads up that there's danger around the corner and you should slow down. So we are co-constructing meaning back and forth between the signaler and the recipient in the moment together for that same signal. What does it mean on this occasion? And we do this all the time. So for example, if you bump into a friend and say, oh, nice shoes. If you've just said, hello, nice shoes, then that is a compliment, and that means something very different to if your friend just asked you, do you like my new coat? And you say, oh, nice shoes, right? So we can change with the same meanings, with the same words, with the same phrase, with the same intonation. We can change the meaning just by the specific context of use. Now, here's the rub. Because in order to study the communication of other species, what we typically do as scientists is we go out there and we get lots of data, lots of lovely data, and then we come up with averages. We say, what does a chimpanzee mean when they raise their arm? What does an elephant mean when they rumble or flap their ears? And so all of that variation, all of those occasions are averaged together so that we can say, what is that timeless meaning? But that will never allow us to get to this fundamental question of whether or not we share all of that flexibility and creativity that we use language for with other species. And to do that kind of work, we have to start to embrace all of that noisiness and variation that scientists are constantly trying to get rid of in their data. We have to dive in and we have to think about how an animal's relationships, how their identity, how their emotion, how their social context in each instance of use is shaping their communication. Now, to do that, we need lots of data. And in my group in the Wild Minds Lab, we've been busy collecting it over the last kind of 6 or 7 years now. We've got a beautiful data set. We have thousands of different individuals. We have nearly 30,000 different cases of ape communication. This is probably at this point the biggest data set in the world. We have been focused on apes, but we've been, as I mentioned at the beginning, having some new friends. Like we've been working with elephants. We've also started to work with young children around the world. And we're including all of that beautiful variation as a feature of our data and starting to think about what causes variation in how an individual expresses themselves. Now, sometimes it's really obvious, right? So we could look, for example, at how an orangutan and a chimpanzee expresses a gesture. And what we see is that when an orangutan produces a reach gesture, they can do that with their arms, with their legs. They're very dynamic about how they produce their reaches, whereas chimpanzees tend to do it with their arms. There's a very good reason for that. That's because orangutans live in trees, and when you're climbing and hanging on, you use whichever limb comes, happens to be free in the moment. Chimpanzees live largely on the ground, and so they can choose, and they tend to use their arms because it's more convenient. So sometimes we see variation in use for really obvious reasons, like you happen to be an arboreal ape. But sometimes the variation in use is much more subtle than that, and so much more interesting. So we see, for example, within chimpanzees, the kind of social group you live in changes actually the way in which you communicate. Now, this figure, those graphs, those are about optimality. And the bluer you are, the more redundant you're gesturing, the more energy and investment and time you're putting into producing each gesture. And the more orange-red you are, the more you're basically inventing a sort of shorthand, something really quick and easy. And we see that if you live in big groups with lots of different kinds of social levels and structures and relationships, you tend to invest in your communication very heavily. If you live in small cohesive groups, you come up with really optimized communication. And it's a little bit like, if you're thinking about communicating to friends and family, you can often start to answer them before they've even finished their sentence. You can have a sort of shorthand between you when you're really familiar with someone you communicate with all the time about the same kinds of things. We see something similar in human societies where if you live in a really large, very multicultural, very diverse society, often greeting rituals, the ways in which you say hello to each other, are much longer and much more elaborate. So we see sort of these similarities in how the society you live in shapes the way in which you communicate, and the chimpanzees are doing that too. We can also look at things like a cultural norm or a sort of dialect. That's something that we see in human language. We see all of that beautiful diversity. And there is a really common chimpanzee gesture. It's a leaf clip. So chimpanzees will tear leaves at each other. This is actually a form of chimpanzee flirting. You can do with that information what you will. But essentially, if you are a male chimpanzee and you want to pick up a girl, you're going to come and you're going to tear a leaf at her. And this seems to work across Africa, across all of the different chimpanzee groups. But when you look at the nuances of it, sometimes you tear a leaf through the middle, sometimes you tear it off at one end, and sometimes you sort of pluck it off quietly, like you might, sort of he loves me, she loves me not, kind of daisy petal style. And something that we looked at recently were these two neighboring groups of chimpanzees in Uganda. So they are living in the same rainforest with everything about their environment is the same. Individuals are going backwards and forwards between those groups. And we saw that the chimpanzees in the Sonso community, those chimpanzees in blue, they're leaf clippers. They tear their leaves through the middle, and that seems to do it the trick for it. It doesn't matter if you're male, female, old or young, you're a leaf clipper. The chimpanzees just over the border in the neighboring Waibira community, they're a little bit more diverse. They use different types, but they're typically leaf pullers. And something that was really exciting for us was we saw some young chimpanzees move from the Sonso community. Female chimpanzees, once they get to be about teenagehood, 13, 14 years old, they'll move to the next door group, and that's where they'll settle and have their children. And our girls who had grown up in Sonso with the Sonso dialect, when they moved to Waibira, they could pick that up no problem. So it was a little bit like they understood the sort of when in Rome rule of having to shift your communication when you move to a new communication environment. One of the last things I'll introduce you to is that we see sometimes differences that we understand well, and sometimes differences where we really do not understand them yet at all. So chimpanzees, when they want to produce long distance communication, they live in these huge rainforests and they are often split up with their friends and family over kilometers of distance. And chimpanzees will drum those big, beautiful buttress roots of rainforest trees. If you hit them hard, they make a fantastic resonance and a deep booming sound that can carry over 1.5 kilometers through the rainforest. But more than that, when they hit them and they're drumming, each chimpanzee has their own signature style. So you could hear a drummer like Ela, who's a sort of classic double beat guy, or Tristan, who's a sort of straight up 4x4 kind of rock drummer. He keeps it very steady. And there's, chimpanzees like Zalu, who are your kind of crazy sort of free flowing jazz. There's no routine to it kind of drummer. So if we can hear somebody drumming, we know who they are. So they've got this way of communicating using rhythm, their individual signatures and styles to be able to communicate not just there's a chimpanzee over there, but exactly who they are, what they're up to at the time. And it's a fantastic system of long distance communication. But we recently started looking at lots of different chimpanzee groups across Africa. And we realized that West African chimpanzees, Western chimpanzees, are really what we would call isochronous, very regular drummers. It's a bit like a metronome. It hits that beat every single time. Whereas the Eastern chimpanzees are a little bit more free flowing. And we just don't know why yet. We have no idea. The forests are the same. The groups they're living in are very similar, but there seems to be this fundamental rhythmic difference in how they express themselves. And we're really this is really new research, and we're really excited to try to understand more why you get these almost cultural variations in drumming styles across the chimpanzee communities. And bringing it back to similarities with language and how we express ourselves, one of the things that is characteristic of human languages is that right around the world, conversations have a particular structure. And typically it's about 200 milliseconds between turns in a conversation. It's actually so fast that it's almost always the case that you're starting to talk before you've actually fully heard the last word in somebody's sentence. We can do this very rapid turn taking between us, which doesn't always mean that we're not listening properly. Sometimes it does, but typically what's going on is we're just really able to predict very well what somebody else is saying, and we understand them, and we get into this back and forth rhythmic conversation. Now, we see both that all humans in every language all around the world hit this quite tight window of about 100 to 300 milliseconds, but also different languages have small variations. So Danish people tend to have a slightly longer, slower turn taking, and Japanese or Dutch speakers have quite fast turn taking. So it's a little bit like, sort of city kind of like fast talkers, or you get a slightly slower country drawl. We get that kind of similarity, but cultural distinction happening all at the same time. And what we were able to show recently was it's exactly the same with the chimpanzees. So not only do they have a rhythm, but that rhythm is very similar to ours. Those turns are happening at about that 100 to 200 millisecond turn. But also in the different groups, we're seeing different rhythms. And so in our case, it's the Sonso chimpanzees up in northeastern Uganda that are the sort of slow talkers, whereas the Isa and Kalinzu chimpanzees, they're a little bit more quick off the mark when it comes to their turn taking and in their conversations that they're sharing backwards and forwards. I'll just start to wrap up a little bit by saying that, we do have evidence for that kind of Gricean communication that I was talking about at the start, where gestures and their meanings are actually quite flexible. So just as in language, where we can have a word like bark that can have many meanings, is it a tree bark or dog bark? And we can decode on each occasion of use by thinking about our partner and what they're saying and what they're talking about, and inferring in each instance from the kind of context what the specific occasion means. Well, the chimpanzees are doing just the same thing. So depending on the relationship between the individuals and what context they're in, the chimpanzee gestures that can hold those same flexible double meanings, the chimpanzees are able to decode on each occasion of use which is the correct meaning that their conversational partners are intending. So I think these are just a few examples of where we can see these important similarities start to emerge even in something as unique as our creativity, our flexibility, our ability to co-create meaning in the moment. And I think with these new big data sets, we can open up all kinds of new questions and think about the ways in which humans and other species are expressing their individuality and their local group identity in their communication, their social identities. And just to come back a little bit, I think one of the most distinctive uses of language, we were talking at the beginning about all those things that language can make easier, but is not for. You don't need it to hunt. You don't need it to share cultures. One of the things that I think is really characteristic about language and how humans use it is in storytelling. And I think actually fireside storytelling is the context in which we started to move away from pragmatic day-to-day communication. Come here, let's do that, give me that, let's get through the day, the sort of mundanity of what language is for, even gossip about our neighbors and friends. And we started to move into things like imagination, into things like who am I, who are we, who are they? Those fireside stories have been suggested to be really this pivotal moment for us of where humans became what is recognizably human as a species, starting to think about who we really are as a species. But I actually think by starting to look at things like how other species, other apes, are sharing individual identities, group identities, how are they forming bonds with each other in those really important ways to construct who they are as a group, that's going to give us really important insight into whether or not even something as apparently unique as storytelling might be something that other species find a way, in their own way, to explain and explore. And so I think I'll finish up just there by saying that, to circle back to that quote from earlier, I think exploring the flexibility and the social context of how other species are expressing themselves will help us make a much more profound description of what it means to be a chimpanzee, what it means to be a gorilla, but also at the end of the day, what it means to be a human. And we need to start to incorporate all of that beautiful social context to go beyond the grand cast of characters and actually explore things like the plot in other species communication as well. I will finish by, of course, saying a big thank you to many of the collaborators and funders that we have. As I said at the beginning, I don't do any of this work on my own. And of course, I can't wrap up without saying thank you to my other family, the apes that at this point I've spent more time living alongside than my human family. I think the chimpanzees would probably happily tell you that after 20 years, I'm still at best a fairly mediocre chimpanzee, but I am very much looking forward to spending the next 20 years or so trying to become a better one. So thank you very much. And I'd love to answer any questions you might have about our work.
Noting that you are also starting to look into the gesturing and language of elephants, do you find any differences or similarities between the gestures of the different species, in that case, elephants and chimpanzees?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing that we do see already in the great apes is that actually they share many of the same gestures. So chimpanzees and bonobos, who are very closely related, have almost identical gestures. Chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas have very similar ones. And actually, human children, very young children, before language comes online at about two years old, they're using a lot of these ape gestures. And obviously, part of that similarity is because we all have the same bodies, so we can express ourselves in different ways. What we see with the elephants, who have just such radically different bodies, is that they use their communication in a similar way. So we're seeing those signs of intentional use, that turn taking. And it makes sense. Elephants are also long-lived, highly social, incredibly complex beings that need nuanced communication. But we're having to get to grips with the fact that they have things like trunks and huge ears that flap. And so we were having to rethink what an action, what a gesture might look like. And one of the things that has been driving us slightly up the wall with the elephants is that olfaction, smell, is so important to them. So we actually have to wrestle with the idea that you might be working with a species where smell is actually, I mean, we think about gesture as being visual, like waving your hand, or audible, like clapping, or even tactile, like touching and stroking. But elephants might be incorporating scent. And we have a gesture that we're affectionately for the moment calling the smell the fart gesture, because they will quite literally sometimes use their body to waft scent in the direction of a partner or recipient. And so we're desperately trying to work out if this is intentional communication on their part, but it's been good fun.
Every day I can tell from the facial expression of Holly that I've done something wrong. Have you done much observation of facial expressions within the apes?
Yes, definitely. So facial expressions are a big part of their world as well. Many of the facial expressions are quite similar to ours. One thing that we do, a good example of something that I often try to highlight to people is you will sometimes see greetings cards, birthday cards that have young apes that are smiling on them where they're showing their teeth. That's one of the few facial expressions that we share, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And I actually often advocate for people, please not to buy them or not to support those images, because usually for a chimp, that's actually an indication of fear. And so it's one of those things where people will often think, oh, this is such a lovely picture, such a lovely image. Those young chimps are often quite nervous in that situation. And so, you can imagine how photographers might make chimps nervous, and it's just not a great. So sometimes our similarities let us understand things better, and sometimes our similarities can lead us astray. But I can tell you that I know very well the look of annoyance that chimpanzee will give. I have occasionally, when the chimps have been hunting and they are so silent in the forest, and I will go hunting with them and occasionally break a stick, and every single chimpanzee in that hunting party will look back at me with what I can describe as the look of shame that I should just. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, guy. Give me. I'll just let you guys go. You go ahead. So yeah, I can feel their annoyance as well, and yeah, facial expressions are a big part of that, definitely.
You mentioned the rhythms of the beating of the trees. Do you think any of that is because they enjoy the music part of it? They enjoy music.
That's a great question. So I wouldn't have had an answer to that until quite recently, but we've just started to see. So in some parts of Africa, there are trees called baobabs that are these huge, huge trees. They can be 8-10 meters wide at the trunk, and they get to be hollow. And we actually saw that in a few of these communities, the chimpanzees are going inside this hollowed out tree, and they're drumming and pant hooting in there. Now, at that point, it's not for communication, because actually the sound is cut, but it must be the most incredible feeling of resonance you get, almost like being right in front of a big bass speaker at a concert or something. And so the only reason we can think of that they're doing it is that there's actually almost a sort of pleasurable sensation of creating this amazing acoustic experience for themselves. So a little bit like almost kind of like a sort of performance music kind of aspect to their drumming. So it's early days, but I think we might have some exciting new findings along that line.
My question, though, is you've been observing and learning the gestures and communications. Have they learned any gestures from you? Have any of your gestures or behaviors become part of their vocabulary?
So one thing I should have said, so my job when I'm in there in the forest with them is, as much as possible, I try to be the most boring thing in their life, because as much as possible, I want to avoid shaping or influencing their communication. So I don't interact with them at all. Now, it's not true that I have no influence. And certainly young apes, when they get to be about 4 or 5 and they want to test those boundaries out a little bit, will come up and gesture at me. Usually, we try to ignore them. But the only exceptions I can think of is, well, first of all, I have an anthropologist who is working with us at the moment, and she wants to study us studying them, precisely because she wonders how much hanging out with chimps makes humans a bit more chimpy, and hanging out with humans makes chimps a bit more human. And so some of those, species boundaries get to be a little bit porous at times. But we definitely try to avoid shaping or influencing their communication. In captivity, that's been done a lot, and it was a real pleasure for me that occasionally when I meet a captive ape, so an ape in a zoo or a sanctuary, I can greet them, using something akin to their own language. And it's always, sometimes it's a little surprising for them, but they respond as they would to another chimpanzee. So it's really nice to be able to sort of step onto their side of the fence sometimes.
I have a question about when investigating and trying to figure out the languages. We're approaching it as a human with a literate background and all of that background to our history. How do you isolate that and prevent from that impacting what you're thinking they're actually doing?
Yeah, it's both a blessing and a curse that we're so similar to each other in many ways, because it can, I was just saying with the facial expressions, lead you down some blind alleyways. And it's something that was very common. So ethology, the study of animal behavior, what we typically do is we come in, we work with a new species, we create our little checklist of signals, and we say, oh, I think raising one arm is different to raising two arms, or maybe raising my arm with my hand up is different to raising my arm with my wrist flexed. So we make these assumptions in advance about what a signal is or should look like. It should be, for decades, we looked only at vocalizations in other species because we have a verbal default for language, which is the default mode, spoken language, but signed language, written language gets expressed in many forms. So there's a lot of ways in which we're starting now to try and avoid some of those assumptions. And one example of that is that we now code every movement of every body part of the chimpanzees. My grad students, it's the equivalent of a swear jar. I'm not allowed to add anything more to the coding scheme, or I have to put money in the coding scheme jar, because we've gone into such detail. So we code in very fine-grained detail just about what the bodies, how they move their bodies. Then we actually use the ape's own behavior and the ape's own reactions to try to parse them out and say, these ways of moving your body make this signal, and these ways make this signal, because the apes react differently to those two different kinds of movements. So instead of sort of coming in with our human-centric assumptions, we try as much as possible to use their behavior to help tell us what to pay attention to. But it's not perfect, but it helps a little bit. We actually realized recently that we had become very chimpanzee-centric. So we'd managed to successfully sort of become less human-centric, but our coding schemes were based on a lot of chimpanzee work. When we moved to the mountain gorillas, we had to make all of these adjustments because mountain gorillas, for example, take much longer to respond. So I would be filming the gorillas, somebody would gesture, I'd be waiting, 1, 2, 3, okay, there's no response. I would cut the video and then the response would come. And so I had to learn to live on a different kind of time frame. We basically say gorillas are living on island time. Everything is just relaxed, takes a little bit longer, they get there in the end. And it's just as rich and nuanced, but it's just in a different time frame. So we do have to think about the perspective of each species as well.
I have a question about when you're living with the chimpanzees and you're eating. What happens when you eat, and how do they react, if they do, or do you go somewhere separate to do that?
I do. So with the benefit of hindsight, we realized that sort of 40, 50 years ago, when you see Jane Goodall out with Gombe or Toshisada Nishida in Mahale, and the chimpanzees are, interacting with them, that's because they fed them with bananas and sugarcane to be able to build that relationship. Now, that's had knock-on effects and big consequences, and we know now that that's very dangerous for the chimps. They can die of diseases. Once you break down those barriers, you can never rebuild them. So it's also quite dangerous for the people who live there now. But we know better now. So what we do now is we just habituate very slowly. It takes about 8 to 10 years before a chimpanzee group will really let you just spend time with them. So this is an incredibly slow process, but we do it just based on trust. And I will go out in the morning at about 4 or 5 a.m. to basically meet them where they're getting out of bed. And then I put them to bed and then I go back to camp. And during that daytime, I usually don't eat very much. I might have a few peanuts in my pocket and I'll kind of nip a few meters away just to snack. But we really try to make sure that we're not interesting to them, and not having food around them is a big part of that.